Okay, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Dissensus. Today we're going to be doing a somewhat experimental episode, which is to say we're going to be keeping ourselves to a comparatively brief and focused 1-hour format. And in part, we're going to be discussing, the shadow. No, but we are in fact going to be discussing the shadow. So Christine has a bunch of questions around dynamics of shadow. I'm going to do my best to sort of catch those and respond to them, and we'll talk back and forth on a few different points, and we'll see how far we get in. So just as a reminder, welcome back to Dissensus, Anderson, Todd, Christine Brophy. We don't have to agree, we don't have to disagree, we can just talk about stuff. Okay, Christine, welcome back.
Hello. So I was just telling Anderson before this that I was rewatching the episode that comes right before this one, and it was a little bit kind of of a personal story, and we sort of talked a little bit about the voices that will hold you back from crossing over the line into uncertainty or crossing over the line into adventure. We painted those out a little bit, but I would like us to kind of generalize them a little bit more, pull them up a little bit more into the symbolic, just so that it's less of like a personal story for me and something that, that you can kind of bridge into and apply in your own life and kind of identify.
Yeah, generalize a bit.
Yeah, generalize a bit. And we ended that episode sort of talking about spark, and but that the way how you're able to identify spark is by sitting in a seat that's like behind your head, kind of like it's not sitting on top of the ego, but it's somewhere behind here. And that like when you've achieved that position, that then you can see the world in sort of like a mythic flow of like symbols and that type of thing. So how you get there though is that first you've got to do a bunch of stuff and then continue to do that stuff. And one of those pieces is like the shadow. So dealing with that. So I would like us to talk a little bit more about that.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel as though I need to very slightly contain a piece of that though, which is, it's true, we did sort of talk in those terms, right? The importance of that mythic access and so on and so forth. What I did not mention in that case is, of course, the cases where people are already having substantial amounts of that, and probably they actually want to dial it down. So this is the sort of more general question. Sometimes you're already leaning in to like excess signification or runaway signification. Your interpretive machinery is going, things are a bit excessively symbolic, right? At the far end of that is what they typically label psychosis, but you can be in lower variations of that where things are symbolic. It's possible for things to be too symbolic, and you want to bring them a little bit closer to the ground, right? So the thing I usually say here is people always think they want more meaning, but they don't always. Ask anybody who's coming off of a serious psychedelic trip if they want more meaning the next day. They don't. They want their oatmeal to sit there.
Yeah.
So they can eat it. Right? So that's interesting. That's uncertainty piece too. So I just wanted to bound that before we got into this, the seating behind and trying to clear that space out in the shadow work. Is just, as with most of these things, you try to bowl it down the middle, and it's not a fixed middle. It's a middle with, variability, so that you're moving closer to whatever mode you need to at whatever moment, right? You're responding appropriately to the moment, but, too high or too low, right? This is what everybody forgets about the myth of Icarus. Icarus makes Daedalus' dad makes the wax wings. He goes flying out across, right? And we all remember he flies too close to the sun and the wax melts and he plummets into the sea.
Yeah.
But people always forget the other part of this, which is if he flies too low, the moisture of the water will waterlog the wings and he will crash into the sea. So Icarus is supposed to be flying a kind of middle path on thermals, right? In the middle. And so anyway, I just wanted to say that we've been talking about sort of the low meaning state and trying to work up towards mythic recognition, but it's also important to recognize that there is an upper space that uncontrolled can be equally, it can get in your way just as much.
That's a good point. Do you think that, well, is it the case? I mean, like, so this is actually diving into the next question about like how shadows come about, but do you think that that they have like a different, like, is there kind of a personality that you could put what their shadow would look like? Like, do they have a different sort of personality of shadow versus somebody who needs to engage more with a mythic landscape, who's kind of overly focused?
Yeah, I mean, so so shadow in the Jungian sense, like where does shadow come from, right? Shadow is the underside of ego, right? So shadow and ego relate to each other in a kind of counterpoint.
Mhm.
How do things end up in the shadow? They are disidentified from the ego, which is to say they're disidentified from the kind of like narrative sense of self that you have, your sense of who and what you are and what you do,
Mhm.
right? So anything that's strongly repelled away from that ends up in the shadow. That can happen for all kinds of reasons. It can happen because you have a strong propensity in one direction. You're a very organized person. A very organized person often has messiness in their shadow, right? So messiness is a shadow issue for them, right? That could be the case. Sometimes it's because it is highly impressed upon us in some way, shape, or form. So like the people raising us tell us over and over again, right?
Mhm.
Waste not, want not, waste not, want not, waste not, want not. And right, eventually we internalize that as what we think is one of our primary values. And the corresponding thing, which is, we already went to a fancy restaurant. What's the problem with paying more for a bottle of wine? Gets
Yeah.
exiled to the shadow.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's like, well, those sorts of people that waste their money, right? It gets exiled and it becomes a moral property of the bad other. And then there's the case where there's something that we do develop partway, right? That we really connect with. And at some point, an adult, possibly well-meaning, comes along and stomps on it in an effort to get us to mature, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Stop doing that. Stop wasting time. Stomp. And if you're picturing somebody stomping straight into a sandcastle, that's about right.
Yeah.
Right. So you get that with kids who like to draw a lot, get their interest shut down in this way. You're never going to make a living at that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Stomp. So that stuff will end in the shadow sometimes if it hits at a bad time. Right.
Yeah.
And the person will throw something away that really brought them a lot of joy. Now, notice that I'm not putting any kind of specific value judgment on any of this stuff. So some of it ends up in the shadow and it really is like, oh, pretty dark, right? There can be some pretty dark stuff in there, but some of it just goes in there because it's the opposite of what they did.
Yeah.
No other reason. And or because it was actually the primary thing that they did, but because human beings, have this mechanism of internalization, right? A strong authority figure can really have that kind of impact on it. We internalize their value and it sort of smashes our value out of the way and hurls it into the shadow, right?
Yeah.
But in fact, it was a thing that gave us a lot of growth in life and enthusiasm, spark. So
Yeah.
this is one of the reasons why doing shadow work does lead to spark. A lot of the time, the growth edges of your personality, you hit, if we're talking about sort of Jungian stuff, right? Jungian personality theory is, as I'm sure most people, who are sort of familiar with this stuff really know, is not that reliable, right? The factor loading and stuff on the Jungian personality metrics aren't great, but there's something to them, right? There's a reason introversion, extroversion, right, makes it as far as it does. And there is a certain, so it's an imprecise tool, right? But every theory is imprecise, as I like to point out. Newton is wrong, but we still use it. So, because it's a hell of a lot easier than working out like relativistic equations for throwing a baseball. Unless you're throwing it very hard. Then I guess if you throw it hard enough, you'd need relativistic equations. Anyway, so, we have these kinds of developmental pieces, and often we sort of, there's the low-hanging fruit and we expand, and at some point often our personality gets stuck. The solutions from one part of our life become the obstacles to the next part of our life. We're choked off by our own innovation. We develop a mechanism, a defense, a coping strategy or something, but it outlives its usefulness, so to speak, right? And then it ends up like the Japanese soldier, right? Manning the island guns for the war that ended 30 years ago. So you can let some of those pieces go. Those are defenses. But then at a certain point, you often feel kind of stagnant. And that's when it's time to reach down into the mud. partly to root around for sort of jewels, right? That's finding spark in there. That thing that you left behind. Oh yeah. Why did I stop doing that?
Yeah.
Right? And there's still a lot of power there. But also to level out some of the things that are like needless divisions in yourself. I'm a this, not a that. It's like, okay, well, like, why? Like, are you incapable of being a that? Are you a that in no sense at all? Like, maybe you should try it, especially if what you're doing right now seems to be causing friction. You know, so shadow work, you know, does have that aspect. That's all what we would call sort of the golden shadow, if that makes sense, right? It's all that positive stuff. Now, there's other stuff down there because none of us are angels, right? We are a rope of being stretched between heaven and hell, and we all have certain propensities, right? Call them animal propensities or call them something more malevolent than that, right? Humans have some pretty dark stuff built in us. You know, when you only have to look at, you know, whatever, primate, zoology, anthropology, a few things, right? Psychology, and I'm not even talking about the obvious stuff like, yes, if you force everybody to role play as prison guards for a weekend, some people turn into dicks. Anybody who's done live action role playing will understand there's ways to screen for that. You know, it's like, no, you hit them with a foam bat, you're out. So, but even aside from that, right, you know, you don't have to look very far to realize that humans are capable of being cowardly, crass, callow, shallow, stereotyped, bigoted, rude, cruel, you know, manipulative, right? We're complex. And we have some intrinsic nastiness, right? Human beings have a real violent streak that needs to be dealt with in some way. You can't just stuff it into the cellar. That doesn't work. So you have to figure out like, well, what do I do with this? It's like a murderous ape that lives in me, right? This murderous sex ape who lives in my body. But I mean, that's part of the question too, right? So shadow work is complex. And the reason why you sort of start with shadow work mostly is that it's sort of obscuring your ability to see more deeply into the unconscious. If you think about it a bit like maybe a glass bottom boat, you know, glass bottom boat?
Yeah.
You ever been on one?
Oh yeah, it got my sister sick.
Oh no.
Yeah, she got seasickness when she was on one. But yeah.
Oh dear. So I think I've been on one a couple of times. There's one up near Flower Pot Island, I think, off Tobermory.
Yeah.
Do you know that place?
No, I don't.
Oh, I think the flower pot finally fell down, so I don't know what they're going to call the
island.
Yeah, it's like you can Google it. It's like a natural, stone structure, and it's up. You know, it's off Tobermory, so it's probably closer to Manitoulin, I think. Flower Pot Island. Anyway, so you can go out there from Tobermory, and you know, there's nice scuba diving and stuff up there at the end of the peninsula, but also you can go out on a glass bottom boat and you can see all this stuff, right? And there used to be shipping in this area, so you can really see stuff down there, fish and whatever. It's a bit like that. Clearing out the shadow is like having, you know, great big clouds of squid ink directly underneath, right? Where the ego is standing up top, but you can't see down.
Yeah. So
you have to kind of pull some of that stuff out, so to speak. Now this metaphor breaks down because don't break the glass at the bottom of the glass bottom boat, kids. You'll get a lot more than personal revelations coming out of the hole. Terrible fish. Yeah, it's a bit like this. Once you start clearing that stuff out, you're sort of building these pieces into yourself selectively. You're bringing yourself closer into maybe some sort of balance, but you're also bringing up new options and opportunities. You're bringing up entire modes of being, possibly, that have been devalued, or, right? It's changing thus the way that you see people as well, because once you start to pull one of these things back, right, it's closer to you, you're trying it on, all of a sudden you look at those people and you don't suddenly think they're the scum of the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, you identify with that value as being you see the positive in it, that you don't just see it as causing like harm. Yeah.
Or at the very least, it starts just playing with it. Typically begins to humanize the other side, right? They stop being a caricature of wrong think. So and then also that sort of beginning, it starts the process of exchange this is in Jungian terms, it starts with the process of exchange with the unconscious. It sort of kicks things off and shows an active engagement and a willingness, right? I'm willing to clear out scary things. And it happens to be closest to the ego. So it's relatively easy, right? You don't even have to go looking for it. It'll jump you at 3 a.m. You just have to be receptive when it does.
Yeah. So I guess like something that that stood out at me, and this is a tough topic, I think, for to wade through, just because yeah, there's a lot that I don't know about it, or there's a lot that I'm still grappling with, I guess, on this subject.
Right.
So
was that explanation I just gave like probably was clear as mud? Anyway.
No, it's more like I guess so. This is the point of it. This is when I hear a lot of stuff that's like describing the shadow, because it's done in these terms that are like
narrative.
Yeah, like the things that you've cast out or stuff like that. Like I don't know. I don't know how to apply that stuff. Like, I don't know how to identify that. Like, I don't know how to identify with that stuff, because what has often happened, I guess, like in my life, for example, is that these things have come, like when you're inside the story yourself and you're making these decisions, and that your life starts to take a turn for the worse. But when you're inside of it, you're thinking that like you're doing a good thing, but then also if you were to ask yourself, like, honestly, if you're doing the right thing, you probably would say no, but you're still like, it's a very confusing space to be in. But then suddenly your life is kind of like taking a turn down, a corner. So if you look at, for example, like the kids from Columbine, one of them was more like a psychopath. The other one, though, when you look at his story, it becomes a little bit more understandable, I would say, how his downfall sort of started to happen. And it wasn't that he was initially like, it wasn't that evil was a murderous impulse that you like suddenly had, just like one day we're walking down the street and you just like, you're walking by someone, it's like, I want to push them into the street. And it's like, it's not that evil is allowing that voice to kind of take control, and that you're just like acting on that impulse, although perhaps that is for some people. But there's this other component of it, which is like a decision that you made in the past, or like you engage with the process of creativity in some way, where you put forward an idea of like a project, for example, that you were going to pursue, or perhaps your idea of what you thought a good partner would be. So that's like your first sort of stepping out into the world. You put forward this thing and you're like, this is what I'm going to do. And then you go ahead and you do that.
Yes. You step out in adulthood with your shitty pencil crayon sketch of what you think an adult is.
Exactly. That's
it's
exactly
wrong.
It's wrong. It's wrong. And so you do that and then you get it wrong. And sometimes
half the things you wrote down that adults told you also turn out to be either impractical, or unfitted, not sufficiently taking into account your context. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, I had a really silly one where like the first person that I dated, it was like, well, what's a good man to date? And it was like, okay, well, I was in the context of basketball, so I chose the person who was like the best at basketball in that camp. And it was like, that's the person quite clearly. And it was like, that is, oh my goodness, the number of things that I didn't take into consideration in that. But it was just like, okay, single context, best person in that scenario, that's the one.
Right.
But then that person ends up being like a bad person, like, or they're not the right fit for you for some reason, or, you're, the project you proposed, you didn't take something into consideration. It turns out that your idea wasn't that good. So what
I would say here is we got to be careful not to make the shadow, in some sense, the whole kit and caboodle. There is a tendency to do that. But a lot of the things that you're describing here, some of them are shadow, but not all of them are necessarily shadow. So like that particular thing you're talking about, the romance gone awry, we'll call it that
But
broad
I would say
category.
it's what happens after that that would be the that's like my understanding at least would be the shadow. So it's not so much like we're all it's like it's not that, but it's the punishing thing that you do to yourself afterwards that my understanding of shadow is, and this is what I wanted to kind of verify, is like that when you get it wrong, you then start to punish yourself for all of the things that like you believe you should have taken into consideration, but really you only just learned because you made a proposal and then got it like, and then you realize that there was some stuff that you left out. So rather than understanding your journey as being a process of learning, you're instead saying from that position, oh, I should have known better, or like I made this mistake, that was my fault. So then you start to punish yourself for it. So that's like one form of the shadow coming about. So is that
okay? So yeah, that can be a certain kind of thing, although a lot of the time, I mean, if under the condition that I was, so not everybody does have that response, for one thing, right?
yeah,
Obviously,
of course
right?
not.
There's plenty of people, for instance, who infer from this, they rather than think I fucked up and I was wrong, they proceed to pile that stuff into the external world, and usually eventually those people steer themselves into the cult of the one true way, right? By which I mean they become the people who are never wrong about anything, never
Yeah.
apologize about anything, and everybody else in the world seems like an idiot and an asshole, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what they think, because clearly, right? So that is a different response, and there's a variety of other responses. Some people don't go through this kind of self-attack. That self-attack isn't just a question of shadow, it's a question of having a strong inner critic, right? And that can be attached to shadow insofar as it has feelings attached to it, but it can also be, really directly pulled from, say, parental modes, right? Critics very often come from parental modes, and they're not shadow per se. Shadow, in this, it depends. It sort of depends how you're framing what you could have done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the shadow is concerned with, when it's concerned with this stuff, it's concerned with it in a moral dimension, right? It's not just that it tells you that you're dumb, it tells you that you're bad.
Okay, so then how does it okay, so you said a couple things there that I find interesting. One is the idea that the critic comes from the familial dynamics.
A lot of the time, not always.
Okay. And then this other thing is that like the fact that the shadow is that it's not just an instant of incorrectness or something, or like an instant of judgment, that instead it's something that it becomes more of like a general classification of yourself, that you are that you're good or bad. That's like the idea.
Oh yeah. So yeah, the shadow accumulates, I mean, all sorts of negative feeling, but this isn't just like a momentary, there, you fucked up. I mean, that could emanate from the shadow, but the shadow is typically more deeply concerned when it's really coming at you with a kind of, it's less like, you did this, but you should have done that, you're dumb. That can verge into you're dumb, therefore you're bad.
Mhm.
Right? So it can go that way, but like a more general, like, you fucked up, you always fuck up, you're worthless, right? It's like in you're bad, and this happened to you and you deserve it.
Yeah.
Right.
So does that, like, I sorry if you just said this, but I just wanted to clarify, does that come about from a series of like events? Like, is it like a progression that happens, or is it that for some people it is just a thing that will happen, like that they'll jump right to you're bad?
Right. So I think that there is some predisposition, possibly genetic, right? That there's some predisposition, as you might expect, right? So I would wager that somebody who is, introverted, agreeable, and neurotic, right, is probably going to, right, have a high sensitivity, right, a difficulty in encountering others, but a desire to please. Those things are going to tend to roll together, and I suspect those people are going to experience that kind of thing more often. This is off the top of my head. I have no statistics to back this up whatsoever. It's barely even a thought, much less a theory, or anyway. But so yeah, there are certainly predispositions, but then a lot of it thereafter is uh, forgive me for using this term, is on the nurture side. It's about what happens to you, your experiences, right? And this is where the cultural level imprints itself, because there's bound to be, right? There are sort of cultural warps in the sense of what is and isn't okay, right? That are going to tend to impress themselves on everybody in the area. And there are familial factors, right? You know, there are families where, you know, like punctuality is seriously important, right? Or families where like whatever, where certain values are held to be preeminent, obedience, for instance, right? That kind of situation is going to tend to imprint that stuff in you, but very much in a way that isn't emerging naturally, and you're probably going to have to wrestle with it later, right? If it imprints something, if it tries to imprint something on top that is wildly at odds with your natural constitution, yes, sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with it. So if you are, naturally a kind of like interrogative, slightly difficult, you like to question, a little bit skeptical, right? This, that you want a little bit of convincing, and you're told to operate within a strict obedience system. The reason is I said so. Yeah, sooner or later that friction starts to boil over, right? It causes problems. Why? Because the original attitude gets displaced into the shadow, but that doesn't mean it stops operating. However, the shadow doesn't just operate in terms of the critical voice. That's part of what I'm getting at. That's one of the things it does. And you sort of pointed, you were like, blank and shadow possession. Possession is way far out on one side, right? Comparatively speaking, quite rare. Complexes don't need to possess you most of the time. They don't need to. Possessing somebody is like, I mean, you know, it's heavy-handed, right? It's really heavy-handed, and they just don't need to do it. They have a main bag of tricks, right? Which is very simple. They can affect salience and they can produce emotion. That's enough. They can affect salience and they can produce emotion. And by doing that, if you're not paying attention, they can lead you around by the nose. So think about this for a second, okay? When I say they can affect salience, what do I mean? I mean, they can make certain objects of your experience. I mean, objects in the world, features of those objects, people, features of those people, mental events of your own, emotional events of your own, whatever. Everything that's passing through the field of your experience, okay? They can either emphasize, they can add salience to things, make them stand out to you, or they can remove salience. They can pull them back so that they don't become as noticeable. Because of all the information that's passing through, very little of it, right, is actually getting any kind of conscious attention. We're picking a few salient details out of Gestalt, right? So they can affect that. So they will pick things out. And you know, you don't have to, you can do a simple experiment, mental experiment on this, right? It's tied in with all kinds of things. And I know I'm describing this at a high sort of abstract level, but consider, for instance, the way that various kinds of memory biases play in when you are sad. When you're sad, you can remember keenly every sad thing that ever happened in your entire life, right? Easy to access. If somebody's like, just think about a happy thought, picture yourself on a beach with a pina colada. And you're like, I can't do that. Like, I can't get there, right? Or I can, but it slips away and all of a sudden I'm pulling up endless sad, right? Okay, well, encoding specificity, right? And there are certain things, we know this stuff about the way encoding works, right? That's a bend in the salience landscape. When you're already sad stuff stands out differently, right? But they can manipulate it very finely. They can turn things invisible. They can make things stand out. People all the time in therapy are like, whoa, I totally didn't notice that. It's like, because it's hiding it from you. And that's a spooky thought a little bit, because as soon as you start getting into this and you're like, wait a second, right? Yeah, there are other living things inside your head and they're fucking with you.
Yeah, I know. They tend to remove the nuance of situations.
Or add it where there isn't any. So they make things stand out, they make things vanish, and then they apply emotion. And it's that simple. You get a physical emotion. So somebody stands out in a certain way, and all of a sudden you're warmly disposed towards them. And what happens? You're like, oh, wow, I'm having this feeling, and that person is standing out to me. I suppose I ought to follow that up. And you've done exactly what they'd like, right? Same thing. Thing stands out to you, scary.
Yeah.
Scary, 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 scary. Well, I know that there's nothing to actually be afraid of, but fuck it, it's not worth the hassle. And you go do something else.
So, okay, so then how do you unwind yourself from something like that? Like, how do you identify it when you're in that circumstance? Because I mean, like, I know personally, like what would start happening is that in those situations, I would stop sort of trusting my own. Well, so you've identified the fact that there's like two types of there, roughly like that there's the two types in terms of like whether you're directing that sort of criticism internally versus externally. And then kind of, and then
Yeah.
there's like this other side, I guess, that we didn't really talk about, which is more like sitting on the angle of pride, and that when you've crossed over to uncertainty, where you achieve success perhaps in some way that doesn't or you achieve success for some reason, but it's not all because of the things that you chose to do or that you were responsible for. And instead, there's like a bunch of unknown stuff that happened, but then you take responsibility for all of that win. And then that will lead you, the part that I'm familiar with is that it then can lead to like a desire for perfectionism, or sort of like a fear of entering or trying the same thing again, because a piece of you knows that you weren't responsible for the win. So then you'll start to like
or less responsible than is acceptable to keep your narrative inflated to the level you feel you need to keep it inflated.
Yeah, exactly. So then you'll back away from things and you won't try. Yeah.
So sure. Well, that's like Dweck, right? That's like Carol Dweck. You know Dweck?
Say more. So I do know Dweck, but say more.
so Dweck's got the learning mindset stuff, right? You can often roll these things together. This is why you can. This is where psychology becomes helpful, right?
Yeah.
Learning mindset, learned helplessness, right? These things, they describe a thing, but then if you extrapolate that out and you start to think about it, then it starts to actually plug in and not just seem like a dumb mechanistic observation. Okay, so Carol Dweck, learning mindset. So you take two groups of kids, you give them both math problems. The math problems are, not pushover easy, but they're not terribly difficult. They're designed to engender a degree of success, probably a high degree of success. So you got group A kids, group B kids, probably some control group, but who cares about that? So group A, I'm the worst scientist, I'm the worst. Anyway, okay. So you got
we're just pulling out personality terms here. We think that those were what would associate with that. Now we're like, there was maybe a control group.
It's fine. Somebody else can be precise. So I cited. So group A and group B. So group A, they finish, they get a pretty good score, and you say, wow, you're so smart. And group B, they finish, get a good score, and they say, wow, you must have worked really hard.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you observe, and what happens is on the next round, you give these kids more difficult problems, and the kids who got told they were smart won't attempt. They'll try fewer.
Yeah.
And the kids who told work hard, well, why? You've internalized a thing. It's a bit of praise. You've injected a little life into a tiny term of self-identity, and they've looped it in. So the kids that got work hard are like, I am a hard worker. And that's why every high openness, low conscientiousness academic in the world thirsts like an ancient vampire for conscientious collaborators, right? Because it's like somebody needs to build the plumbing for this geyser I've constructed in my head. So you've been told you're a good worker, and so you'll work, you'll be diligent, you'll apply yourself, you'll try, you'll show stick-to-itiveness, grit, stubbornness, moxie. Okay, the kid that gets told I'm smart can't afford to have that challenged.
Yeah.
Because if they get it wrong, right? This is a variation on, I would say, one of the most common anxious patterns of self-diminishment, which is if I don't play, I can't lose.
Yeah.
Which you see with people all the time, all over the place, right? If I don't play, I can't lose, right? And it's like, yeah, but you can't win either. That's a terrible Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it's amazing how that happens. I know, like This is something I think about a lot, just because I know when I played basketball, there was a few tryouts where I was stretching beyond my skill level that I had, and I was trying to achieve something greater. And I went to the first tryout, and I did really well beyond like what I thought that I could do, and then I was a coward after that, and I decided not to go to the second tryout. I was like, oh, they can just judge my ability based on that like first time, and I'm like and I was just afraid of that I would prove to be worse than that first shot where it like seemed where I surprised myself, and so just like backing out of things like that. But then the problem is that when you start making decisions like that, you you stop being able to trust yourself again. Like you can't trust when you're actually backing out of something, perhaps because like you're actually sick or you're actually injured, or you're actually like would be better off if you were a little bit more prepared. But if you don't sort of test the line there, then you stop being able to trust your instincts on that stuff. So then you kind of start taking hard positions.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, also part of the thing is, okay, so how do you tie that knot? The answer is, of course, that you bullshit yourself, right? Like you bullshit yourself into the reason that I, didn't do that or something was because really, could I possibly improve on the first day? Or is this necessary? Or is there any value to it? Or what do I have to prove? Or, right? What's the antidote to that? Being honest. No, I was afraid. I've certainly bailed out on things because I was afraid. I mean, I get a lot of social anxiety. So I have gotten social anxiety at pretty much every single social gathering I've attended since I was like 4, right? To the point where this could be a small gathering with only my friends, right? In a completely informal situation with no set of expectation and no nothing. And as it's coming up, I'll be going, oh God, why did I agree to do this? Like I think I'm just not gonna. Okay. Why? I don't know. Done it since I was a kid. It's just the anxiety becomes so strong about the possibility that it's like, no, not happening, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm afraid. Now, why am I afraid? Well, that's a whole separate ball of yarn. But there are things in there. And in fact, that is in some ways maybe points to an interesting instance of shadow switching. I have occasionally suspected that I am not, in fact, an introvert, but rather that I am a wounded extrovert.
See, yeah, okay. See, this is what I'm like. That's like a little bit of like one of my questions about this as well, is that idea that you kind of like walk into things perhaps with like unbalanced instincts, and like part of that might be because of the values that your family has placed as you grow up, like things where they've put an emphasis on. Part of it is like, the way how you were born, just like your natural sort of instincts and inclinations, and in some way you kind of, is it that you've walked in like an unbalanced sort of way? Because like if you were appropriately balanced, you would have kind of like the right measure of like agency and acceptance to be able to like navigate these situations. But instead we're inherently like, we walk in sort of like a little off keel, and then we end up being like a wounded extrovert or something like that, because you forged in with your sword and then you got hit right away. And
yeah, it's both, right? Look, clearly. So this is why right off the bat we were talking, I said the question here is what are problem people?
Oh yeah, they weren't around for that.
Oh yeah, okay, well, so right, you weren't around for
that. so a little
forget I said anything. Okay,
a little context maybe I should
no, we could just pick it up here. So we'll just pick it up there, because the thing that actually occurred to me, I was thinking about the concept of problem people. We don't need to explain it any more than that, because the question is, what's a problem person?
Okay, yeah.
Right? So I thought about it and I was like, well, the thing is, problems aren't objective features of reality. Problems don't exist in the world.
Yes, okay.
Problems are things that exist with an agent relative to two states of transformation, right? You have a situation and you desire a different situation, which you may or may not understand. But
Yeah.
right. And of course, sometimes the answer is you just don't want what you have now. It's like, oh my God, anything else. But most of the time it's like you have this, you want this, and you don't know how to get between the two, right? That's means ends analysis, right?
A goal landscape setup.
Yeah. So initial state, transform. So, but problems only exist in that context. There are no problems in the world. So there are no problem people in the world either, because there are no problems in the world. You know what I mean? Any problem person is only a problem person relative to a particular person, a particular goal, person or people, a particular goal, and a particular set of constraining values around it, socially speaking. A person who is a problem person in one situation isn't a problem person at all in another situation, right? And part of the thing, I was just going to say, and now we're in a funny line here, because a little bit it's like, the temptation on that basis would be to say something like, right, which is why we should just like let it all hang out, or anything should go. We should stop being so judgmental, right? Yes, yeah, true. But it can't be the case that everything just completely runs riot, right?
Yes.
So, and there is a balance of that goes on when you're doing this kind of work. There's a little bit of like, you got to figure out how to fit into the tribe in some way, right? But then there's also like, it's their opinion, it's your life. Turn into the thing that you're turning into. And how do you balance those two things out, right? The individuality, social thing. Do you see what I mean in that respect?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was going to bring up, because as you were saying the thing about how there's no such thing as problem people, then the immediate thought that came to mind was like, okay, but wait a second, like we can't forget about like murderers. Like people were just running roughshod like murderers, that like that component of, okay, yeah, but we are humans in real bodies in a human context. So there is some sort of, we do have it's not just that like there's an ideal that's all completely constructed, just like a social construction, or like, or that there is actually something that is, given our context, the real context that we are in as humans, that you can say that there is some things that are problems that are for all of us.
Social construction is the real context that we're in as humans. Those aren't two different things.
Sorry, not that then. We'll say,
okay, there are some things. I'm not saying it's a completely culturally relative anything goes.
Yeah.
That isn't what I'm saying. And yes, probably at the ultimate level it is. But we all have basically the same setup. So there are some shared things that we have to take into account, right? Generally speaking, prohibitions against murder, that occurs in pretty much every culture. So, there's a reason. It's like, well, you just can't go stopping people in that way willy-nilly. It's annoying. It causes a lot of problems socially. It causes people emotional destruction. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Right. Except typically in a limited number of cases where any given culture will in fact completely condone it and create all kinds of art that valorizes it. Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's true. I know because I've been exploring this space, but there are definitely a host of mythological spaces where we think taking action into your own hands and dealing with a situation in this way is very romantic, right? So we don't always prohibit it, but generally speaking, within the context of sort of whatever civilized behavior, we have prohibitions. So it's true. In the same way as we can talk usefully about archetypes because we have some shared background in biology, I agree that we can talk usefully about sort of, let's call them archetypal values at some level, even with a lot of variation. That's true, right? But the question is, how many people fall into the category of being like universally problematic, transculturally problematic, versus simply being operating against the flow of some kind of programmatic consensus? I don't know why I'm in the $10 word bag.
Well, it's totally, this is the whole problem of like where you've got like an established authority, and then how do you make sure that what you're doing is not just squashing out the source of life, which is like the next generation coming up, or like the, you know, the individual and like individuality, and them sort of like experimenting and like pushing up against the boundaries or rebelling in some way. Like you, when you're talking about like a problem person, there is the one angle of it, which is like, oh yeah, but like maybe they're just a problem for you because you're sitting on top of a different value than they are, versus being able to like identify things as problems in general, which is like this idea of like somebody who is perhaps, well, so I'll take it back to.
But see, I think the identification of the problem in any given case, okay, goes back to, goes back at least as far as Aristotle, right, if not further. And the thing is not to recognize the manifestation of the extreme state, but the tension of values that it represents. Right, Aristotle talks about this. So if right, cultural values change over time. Right, within a culture, they change generationally, time over. You can see this happening. You go through history, and each upcoming era has a kind of reactionary response to the era that precedes it. Right, Hegel picked this up, and right, it's so there is this sort of point counterpoint thing that happens. To some extent, that's understandable. It's a lot like the old saw, right? Like theories only really pass out of a science once the person in the emeritus chair dies. Come before me, that I may criticize your thesis. So that's how theory moves through, right? And it's never really gone until the person is gone. And so you get a bunch of people and they're heretical upstarts. This is basically paradigm shift shit, right? You get a bunch of people, they're like, this theory doesn't really explain this data. And finally they get, and they're like, they've got enough of it that they're like, your dominant theory of toad splitting is clearly incorrect, sir. And then finally they die and you get a transition. The same thing happens at the cultural value level. You get a relatively conservative generation, and then after them, their kids are like, our parents were so lame and conservative. We need to be freer. And so you get a freedom generation. And then after the freedom generation, you get a tonically over relaxed generation, and that causes its own problems. And then there's a counterpoint to that. That kind of stuff just happens. It's like we just swing too wide. It's the same thing that we do with our life. We identify. So in talking about the shadow thing, often you'll get a strong polarization. Somebody will pick up the opposite value, suddenly find it gives them life, and then take from that is the new way of being.
Yeah, that everybody must follow.
Yeah, that's right. And not everybody. That's true too, because people are prone to generalizing their insights in ways that are not always warranted, right? But also like they'll hold it up. This is the new way. It's like, no, put them together. Put them together. But you have to, typically you swing and overswing a few times. And the expression, right? Generals are always planning for the last war.
I do. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So are we.
Yeah.
So what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is that there's a set of sort of types, but the generalizable thing, the problem that we're talking about, isn't the problem of one extremity or another. It is the higher level problem of achieving the useful balance between two properties. And we have such a tendency to polarize things. I mean, my God, if you look at the sort of social theory that underlies our politics right now, aside from, until very recently, sharing the concept of progress, right? Like we had a universal concept of progress across the Cold War. We had a universal concept of progress, right? The Soviets were going to eat, in the year 2000, there will be cosmonauts eating pineapples on the moon. I love that. Right? But even then it was like progress. That's the real dominant myth. Economic and political organization is secondary to it. Progress. Okay, very recently you've seen a flip over where the right is beginning to not talk about progress. They're beginning to talk in golden age terms. Now the left is beginning to talk in golden age terms a little bit, right? So you're getting a little bit of reference back, but mostly they've maintained this forward momentum thing. But the point is, it's all wickedly highly more polarized all the time. And that polarization and finding a balance between the positions is the actual problem. It's not about one end or the other. It's about figuring out how the two things usefully integrate. And if you think about it, this is like, it seems to me really obvious. Like, isn't the core, you look at the States, and I know a number of people here from the States, and Canada has these issues to some extent too, but for Americans watching, the political landscape here is different. You may see some echoes, but it's a different animal. Canada and the States are really politically quite different, despite echoes that have occurred. And you look at the States and it's like, well, obviously the core problem is, how do two very different things come together and work together? What other question could there be there? I mean, like, you have 300x million people divided down the middle. You can't have two things that are that highly at odds with each other and highly distributed. The question is, how do two very different things find a productive way to work together, right? And this is the general problem we face. That's the problem. But what we tend to do is we assign problematic features in counterpoint to whatever the dominant value is within the kind of cultural moment. That's my thinking. But you should disagree, because this is Dissensus, the show where we can agree, or we don't agree to disagree, but we can disagree. Anyway, we don't have to fight.
Yeah, so I guess, like, for me, I'm trying to loop this back again to like the individual, and just that, like, when you're in those moments, and forgive me if we're looping around in a circle here again, just because I need to make
That's
sure
okay.
that
That's called circumambulation. That's all good. That's all good.
I need to make sure that I understand it, that it makes sense to me. So in those moments, though, when you're walking into those situations, so you cross over the line of uncertainty, but you actually don't really, when you're in those moments, you don't really realize that that's like what you've done, because what you're doing is you're operating on a past strong value or something like that. So, for example, the idea that, like, well, so like the relationship didn't turn out the way how you thought that it would, but then you're going to operate on the principle or the heuristic of, like, well, okay, but I just need to, like, try harder. Like, there's something that I should be doing right now to just, like, try harder or something like that. But you don't realize that, like, in that moment, that it wasn't supposed to be something that you just try harder on, but rather this is a time where you're supposed to kind of just like the universe is telling you, like, let it go, you need to move on. So you're going to keep trying harder, you're going to keep trying harder, and you're going to keep pushing until.
What does trying harder mean?
Like, editing your behavior. Like, you're going to try a different approach, you're going to try and, like, be more, I don't know, like being more persistent in a certain way, or being more understanding in a certain way, or,
what do I need to do differently to make this work? Then
yes,
is that
exactly.
Is the question. What do I need to do differently to make this work? Okay.
Yeah.
And you keep sort of pouring attention, thought, and energy into doing so.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So you continue to do that, but then you find that all of your resources are sort of starting to be directed toward this one thing. And then you start pulling on other people in order to support you in that way, that while you're, like, kind of focused on that. So, like, I remember, like, when I was younger, pouring everything into a relationship, and then, like, you start, like, lying to other people, and you start stealing or other types of things. And so your life kind of starts to take, like, if you're standing on the outside and you're watching what this person is doing, it's like, wow, like,
you're tilting into chaos
yourself.
world.
Yeah, you are. And you're starting to become, like, the person that you're like in love with, or that object that you're in love with. Like, you're starting to kind of turn into that thing, just by trying to become something that is lovable to them in your own mind. So when I think about, like, shadow, I think of that. And I guess I'm trying to make the bridge between that and what you're saying, which is this idea of the balancing of values, that it's not like that person is a problem person. Like, even though perhaps, like, like, the response to uncertainty was, rather than being able to accept or like having, I guess maybe this is it, like having the appropriate balance there, where you would kind of not just prioritize the one side of the values, which is like, I can control this situation, and instead you'd sort of be able to play around with them, I guess, a bit more. That if you don't have that capability, that is when it becomes a problem, but it's not, but really it's an issue of balancing of the values. Is that correct? I'm sorry, that was like a long sort of
no, I get
I'm
it.
just
I get
trying
it.
to bridge this.
Okay, so ultimately you're moving in the direction of balancing values, but first there has to be a kind of detangling involved. So like, so this is in fact a good deal more of the like, you're at the movie theater, you have to learn to sit one row back from yourself, pay attention to the conversation between yourself and the two people that yourself came with, while also watching the movie and noticing how they're watching the movie. It's that kind of information. Okay. So you know, and again, obviously that's a metaphor. You keep asking me direct questions and I keep speaking. First, you must answer riddles 3. You know, but sorry, that's how this stuff is.
This is the dungeon master coming out. Just
yeah,
like,
if you want me, I can put up my Dr. Strange stained glass. I dismantled my consulting office, so I've got that. I can put that up. A mutual friend of ours, in fact, once came in, and I had a running litmus test that was I always thought quite interesting. When people came in, some people would never even notice the stained glass, right, which was always interesting in its own right, or they wouldn't mention it. But a lot of people would notice it, and they would say, you know, what is that, right? Only a couple of people were like, is that the Doctor Strange symbol? But they'd be like, what is that? And so I would say, well, what does it look like? What do you think it is? Right? It's a little impromptu projective test. Anyway. Yeah. And our mutual friend saw it and she said, a basketball? I said, a basketball? It's me. Why would I have a basketball? Glass. Anyway, I could put that up if you want. But riddles 3. So what was I going to say? Okay, so you have to detangle. So what I mean is, okay, so you know, you mentioned this question around pride. You're talking about a few different things here again, right? So there's some shadow. When you're talking about this, you know, the relationship with the person where in order to like them, you are gradually modifying at the very least your persona in order to fit in more closely into the world they inhabit, but that world also is a world that is considerably perhaps more fraught, chaotic, or dangerous than your regular world. I've probably been that person for a few people. I mean, to the extent that I was a less respectable motorcycle boyfriend, I probably brought the chaos periodically. But leaving that aside, okay, so there are a few things going on there, right? Some of that would be projection, and again, it's sort of more properly you would want to be looking to anima or animus, to contrasexual soul image stuff, right? But that comes after. There are shadow bits here too, though, when you specifically address the sitting back and the pride or humility piece, and you mentioned certainty. So the thing that I would say here is that those 3 things plug in together. Step 1 is, if you want humility, you, I think, ought to this is my personal opinion, but I think you ought to very strongly double down on epistemological humility. You should very strongly double down on reducing the notion that you have certainty about anything. Certainty, in my opinion and experience, is a pernicious mirage. We have certainty, and we see other people have certainty in conditions where pretty clearly in the post examination, during the postmortem, you're like, well, that certainty was wrong. Or you can see somebody else who's so certain, right? You can have 2 people who are perfectly certain about the opposite thing. Certainty is not a reliable ally, right? Also, you can want certainty really badly and not be able to get it, and therefore not be able to act. But in fact, you don't have it. It's right. Now, don't get me wrong. There is the odd time that you do get, and this is the bitch with intuition, right? You get these weird, implicit, somehow lightning bolts, and you're just like, boom, oh yeah, I know what to do. Right? What are you supposed to do with that? And what are you supposed to do with your general assessment of things? Well, that's tricky, right? A big part of the work that you're doing early on is just learning how to tease apart the illusion while knowing that you're never going to completely tease it apart. It's impossible.
Yeah.
You're never going to remove all the illusion. You're never going to remove all the hallucination. You're never going to remove all the projection. The fact is that the idiosyncrasies and damage of your mind is intricately right and ubiquitously woven in with the whole way that you experience and frame reality. You're never getting away from all of it. Stop trying. You're not going to.
It's so interesting that you said that, because I mean, this brings up two ideas for me. One of them is like, initially when you first said that thing about the uncertainty, that like, you know, prioritizing, or like, you know, with humility, that you recognize the fact that like when that things are not as certain as you think that they are. And then I know that if you grasp onto that idea a little bit too tightly, though, then what happens is, like, for example, again, in relationships, that you'll again, like, you can actually, that would then become like a negative thing, which then tells you, oh yeah, but like your instincts that you have, that like something is wrong here, you're like, well, but I'm actually not really clear, like this person did something that I didn't really like, but it's like, but it's all uncertain, so maybe I'll just like hang around still. And it's like, but then after like repeated instances of that, it's like, okay, now you just have to act as though it is certain, in order to remove yourself a bit from the situation. So that was just a thought that kind of came up.
You know, the thing is, when I say that you can't have it sort of perfectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't have it in the perfectionistic mode that people want it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't sort of relative levels of certainty, right? It's still uncertain ultimately and unpredictable at the bottom, right? But I would still put good money that the sun will rise tomorrow. Like if I had to place a bet, and that, you know, that's really honestly where the rubber meets the road, is like, would you put a bet? And if people are like, I don't care about money, then you have to bet something you care about, right? The point is, right, if you'd be willing to put it on the line, then, you know, you think you got pretty good certainty on it. People are just badly miscalibrated about this. I mean, you know, you think about, we say the sun come up tomorrow, right? Now, technically, that's not exactly wrong. But, you know, the idea the sun is coming up, you know, was what fueled everybody into thinking the Earth was the center of the universe. Everybody. And everybody was wrong. Right?
Yeah.
It's the most obvious thing in the world, and they're all wrong. So, but now, just to be clear here, just to be responsible, pedagogically responsible. You know, it's also not the case that the sun doesn't go around the Earth and the Earth doesn't go around the sun. That's what relativity is all about. Your fixed point is just a question of simplifying calculations relative to other moving objects. That is the only thing that centrality or stillness is. That's the theory of relativity. And if you have a hard time wrapping your head around that, it's because it's fucked up and your ape brain wasn't designed to do it. Right? It's like, but I just want to throw a rock at that bird because it looks plump. It's like, yeah, that's right. You know, very Newtonian. Anyway, so, you know, but long story short, right? Like there is a level on which the Earth isn't the center of the universe. Maybe, maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe it is the center of the universe, and human beings
find out that it is.
Are actually the most important thing in the universe. Wouldn't that be nice? I don't think so. I think what we're sadly finding out that actually we've gotten a little big for our britches, and it turns out that if you just go around kicking things over, sawing things down, burning them, eating them, and shitting on them, eventually the place gets kind of messy. Anyway.
This is it's the funny thing of like how we all have these like mini realizations in our own life, where it's like we think that we're, well, because like we live within our own heads and our bodies, it's like what we're doing is the most important thing, and like we're obviously the most important person to that person. If we fall short in like this one way to them, like we've ruined their life in some way, and it's no. Yeah. No, you're not that important.
It's not that big of a deal. Yeah, that's all your ego, right? It's the same piece that's what's often powering that whole, like, you should have thought of this, and you should have thought of that, and you should have thought of this, and you, right? The ego, the way I expressed it, a friend of mine had an in-law who once sat down to the dinner table, like Thanksgiving dinner or something, and loudly proclaimed, "I'm the boss of this meal." It's like, meals don't have bosses. right?
How did that come about?
I'm the boss of this meal. Because
that,
it was just a genuine expression of a desire for hierarchical control over mealtime. I don't know. But the point is, that's the ego talking. I'm the boss of this meal. I'm in charge of this thing that doesn't need charge taking. And also you're not. And also, like, right? But that's what the ego wants to be in charge of everything all the time. And important. And if anything's happening and it's outside the ego's control, the ego starts to become terrified. Oh no, what if I'm irrelevant and I'll be destroyed? If I go down, the whole thing goes down. It's like, no, it doesn't. Everybody is doing their job. You just do your job, right? And I'm the boss of this meal also goes in with that inflated sense of importance, right? Oh no, this very small thing I did has catastrophic effects. I've ruined lives. Or, right, like, I can't possibly leave such and such a thing, because if I do, right, the universe will crumble to its foundation. Without me.
Do you think so? This is like a little bit looping back to what we were saying before, where like you move from the thought of just like you're dumb to being then you're bad. And with same things with like these things, like I know that we all have those kind of instances where like our ego just kind of like rears its head. It's like whether we're coming off of like a big win and we're kind of like, we're invincible. And then you walk into a new situation. It's like, no, we're not. Or like, that's like
the worst. That's the worst. I prefer feeling invincible. That's just me, maybe.
Same. Yeah, same. I've come to have like this sort of reflex now of like when I get that like I'm invincible and it's like, oh no, it's coming.
No,
it's definitely it's coming. It's coming. When is it coming?
But well, see, I try not to fall into waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah,
right? Things are too good. Lots of people get that, right? Oh no, things are going too well. Is this a trap?
Yeah.
Right? No, I try not to get that, but I also try not to fall into the tendency to be like, well, there we go. It's all sorted. Everything's coming up. Millhouse. You know, like, that's it. That's it. I finally solved life. You didn't.
So I guess like what I'm asking though is like, given the fact that like there's that natural sort of human bit where it's like we're all going to have instances of that stuff, and like to hammer down on that is a bad idea, because you got to figure it out. You got to like play around with these things, but as a way of like just kind of recognizing when you've crossed over a line, when you're holding on a little bit too long, like you're failing to see reality, that you've held on to a dream, this dream world that you've started to fabricate of like based on perfection, or things like that. What are things that you can do or that you can pay attention to be like, oh crap, something's going on here? And you said like one of them is to have a conversation with somebody where you just kind of like admit that you're like afraid, or that's what happened. So like it seems like a bit of like a confession to somebody. But what are other things?
But also to yourself.
To yourself, yeah.
Not just admitting to other people that it's the case.
Yeah.
But admitting to yourself that it's the case.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes not just for fear, which in some ways is probably not for everybody. For some people, it's a much harder thing to accept. But for any of the shadow emotions, fear, anger, sadness, right? But then also, the instances where you were a shit. Like we all do shitty things. We're all sometimes mean, sometimes neglectful, sometimes cruel, sometimes petty, sometimes thoughtless, sometimes, right? Like we all are. None of us are morally perfected. Right? And we want to distance ourselves from it, especially if we feel ego weak, because it feels bad, because it rapidly cascades into you're bad. And if anybody finds out, they're going to abandon you. Go live under a bridge, right? That comes up a lot. The number of people who think they're going to wind up under bridges specifically. I want to write about this. It's under a bridge specifically.
Are you serious?
Why? And is there a connection with trolls? See, there's a whole book here. Anyway,
Under a bridge, really?
under a bridge. That's
I
what people
wouldn't have
say.
thought that. I would have
Yeah,
like,
I'm going to end up under a bridge, living under a. I mean, you look under bridges and you can kind of see there are people there, and it doesn't
that's
look
true.
like a great place. I've slept under a bridge a couple of times, and admittedly, when it was windy, it sucked. It
Huh,
was
you'd
also
think they
really
would
loud.
protect you. I could see the loud, yeah.
It was really, really loud, and I didn't realize how loud. This was a British, was in Northern England,
Hmm.
and I was sort of tucked into a concrete bit. I don't know why. I must have not been able to find a better place to sleep. I was homeless. Hello, home audience. I was homeless. So I must have not been able to find a better place. Usually I was able to find a good building, there was a sweet vegetable cannery that I lived in, got completely abandoned, but the sweet vegetable cannery that I lived in for a while, and it was really nice. It was waterproof. Anyway, so
Were you able
and
to have some of the vegetables as it was a cannery?
no, are you kidding? It was it was empty, but I had my own canned goods. I was very, yeah. Anyway, okay. Fun hobo stories another day. So, but what I
We'll
was going to
loop
say
back
is,
around to those for sure.
yes, sleeping under a bridge. It was pretty taxing. Like it was a suboptimal place to sleep, but it's
Yeah.
it's the specificity. I can think of lots of not great places to sleep, but people idiomatically always seem to converge there. Anyway, leaving that aside. So there's a much bigger question that you've just uncorked, but you have to go.
I know. So
Yeah.
we'll have to pick that up because like I wanted to I want to dig more into like the stuff of like that people can do that's within their own power to like recognize these things and to see them. And sometimes it's just a matter of like it's not within your own power, but if you go have a conversation with somebody else and talk about these things, then you'll be able to kind of start seeing where your blind spots are.
So maybe I'll pencil it in, and it'll be a very rough sketch, but step one, pay attention.
Oh no. Yeah, this is a really rough sketch. Okay.
Step one, pay attention. What do I pay attention to, you might ask? Pay attention to your feelings, right? That's probably the one that most people are missing. Or pay attention to your associations, which is sometimes the case. But in general, just pay attention. Your processes are going to be doing things. Pay attention. Pay attention. Look for patterns. Try to notice stuff, especially if you don't feel good. If you don't feel good, then try to do some pattern seeking, but then also hold it lightly.
Yeah.
Because the interpretations you come to if you're in a deep emotional state are necessarily skewed by that state, right? You don't have the same kind of processing capacities. You need to hold things epistemologically lightly. So this is the move away from certainty piece. So it's one, pay attention. Two, pay attention with a very slight amount of cognitive remove, right? This is the even hovering or the mindfulness or the sitting one step back in the theater. Paying attention also, notice how much attention you have to pay to watch yourself, watch the two people who are sitting on either side of yourself that you're talking to, and also watching the movie and also watching their reactions to the movie. This is the level of pay attention that we're talking about, but anything that you get out of that is something.
Yeah.
Right? Anything you pick up is telling you something. You don't have to get every single stream of every single conversation, because in fact, it's a lot more than three people sitting in front of you. But if you start by doing that,
start with
by paying
one,
attention,
and then you'll follow that to its logical conclusion, then you start to unwind this stuff.
Right. And so there's a mindfulness quality to it because they zip through, and like with mindfulness, you grab them and you label them and you let them go. Fine. All I'm saying here is grab them, label them, take a quarter of a second to like look at them or file them or something, and then let them go. Then go back and pull out the box and be like, well, that's interesting. Right? So pay attention to your feelings, do so in an even hovering way, and practice strong, like epistemological uncertainty acceptance, radical acceptance of that. Right. So that you can form patterns, but you're not getting hung up on them. You have room to maneuver without trying to gel it. I suppose that's the other thing, patience, but that's part of pay attention. You have to be patient. Sometimes it's a process, and like biological processes, they don't benefit from you freaking out. Right. The flowers don't bloom faster because you scream at them. Okay, so we'll pick this up next time. Enjoy your delicious meal tour.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Okay. And okay, so we'll return and we'll come up, and then it will be after Labor Day. No more wearing white, which, as you can see, I was doing a lot of Okay, see you next time. Libido is, in essence, sexual energy. And Freud makes the, frankly, for the period, quite astute observation that this sexual energy is the very essence of the nature of life, right? There is an important sense in which that's what we are. We are machines, we are replicators, right? Living things are things that make copies of themselves. And for sexually reproducing things, that means sex. I don't know what it feels like to be a single cell bacterium that just splits. Does that feel good? I don't know. Probably. I don't know. I've never, oh God, that's a camera. All right, anyway. We go home. How was lecture? Good, I mocked up a paramecium orgasm. Anyway, okay.